Opening the center like this immediately challenges black's options and prepares a fight for central squares. Immediately contesting the center establishes equality and opens up familiar defenses, preparing for a balanced positional struggle. Immediately challenging the center. This thrust aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and seize valuable space, solidifying the central pawn structure. This choice prepares for pawn advances and pawn chains, hindering white's queenside expansion for now. Developing the knight here prepares for queenside castling, reinforcing the d4 pawn and creating a solid center for white. Developing a knight to its natural square is a fundamental step in controlling the center and preparing for castling, solidifying central control and preparing for pawn advances. This knight efficiently supports the pawn chain while eyeing crucial squares. Abandoning the central pawn in exchange for potential queen's knight development offers an aggressive, yet potentially risky, path to dynamism. Reclaiming the pawn with this move solidifies central space and prepares for rapid piece development. Proactively securing the central pawn with this gambit is a bold declaration, aiming to expand aggressively on the queenside and disrupt white's development. Challenging black's pawn expansion. This advance aims to disrupt the queenside structure before black can solidify their queenside pawn chain. White seeks to exploit potential weaknesses on the b-file or create outposts if black's pawn on b5 falls. Embracing the pawn chain. Black reinforces their central advance, creating a blockade that gains territory and restricts white's kingside development, forcing white to confront the burgeoning pawn structure before it becomes an insurmountable obstacle. Retreating the knight to b1. A seemingly passive maneuver, actually seeks to untangle the queenside and prepare a potential pawn advance with b3 and b-flat2, aiming to control the long diagonal and support the a4 pawn's forward thrust, all while avoiding immediate tactical complications. Developing the bishop to a more active diagonal. This square aims to pressure white's center and potentially create counterplay on the queenside by controlling the long diagonal. Securing the queen on a commanding square. White aims to support the central pawns and prepare for a potential queenside pawn storm, while simultaneously eyeing the diagonal that leads towards black's castled king should it venture that way. Unleashing a pawn surge. Black aims to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially trap the queen. This ambitious pawn advance forces immediate decisions, potentially sacrificing material for positional gains or initiating a sharp tactical sequence. Retreating the queen from danger. White forfeits the queen's central influence, signaling a passive defense to consolidate the compromised queenside pawns and perhaps prepare a kingside attack later. Fortifying the center and preparing for queenside expansion. This move solidifies black's pawn structure and opens lines for development, creating a resilient setup against white's ambitious pawn push. Developing the bishop to a natural square. b2 aims to prepare castling and connect the rooks, while also reinforcing the d4 pawn and anticipating potential skirmishes on the kingside. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize central space. Black initiates a dynamic confrontation, aiming to disrupt white's queenside space advantage and potentially open lines for their pieces. This aggressive intent challenges white's structural integrity, forcing an immediate response to the encroaching pawn chain. Securing the monarch against any immediate threats is paramount. Initiating the castling sequence brings the king to a safer haven behind a wall of pawns and prepares the rook for potential central involvement. This knight's arrival at c6 is a crucial reinforcement, bolstering the central pawn structure and preparing to challenge white's ambitious queenside pawn push. aiming to restrict white's space and potentially create counterplay on the queenside. A bold repositioning. Knight 5 immediately challenges the centralized bishop and creates fascinating tactical possibilities on the queenside by forcing black to react and potentially compromise their pawn structure. The immediate centralization of the rook on c8 aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside and challenge the open c-file, creating potential tactical skirmishes in the center and a fight for the initiative. Initiating a daring knight sortie to the queenside. This maneuver aims to seize the initiative on that flank by potentially outmaneuvering the black knight and supporting a subsequent advance, perhaps targeting the vulnerable c5 pawn. Challenging the center directly, black accepts a temporary pawn deficit to open lines and activate the bishop on a6. This exchange, while seemingly simple, creates a dynamic imbalance, aiming to disrupt white's development and potentially pressure the weakened d4 square. A bold gambit by white, sacrificing material to shatter black's central pawn structure and disrupt coordination. A bold attempt to disrupt white's central influence and generate counterplay. The queen's excursion to d5 directly challenges the knight on c4 and simultaneously eyes the potential weakness on the f3 square. A subtle but important positional consideration. This maneuver highlights black's proactive approach, refusing to cede space passively and instead seeking to activate their pieces in the face of white's developing initiative. It's a gamble that could lead to dynamic exchanges or, if mishandled, leave the queen exposed. The key will be whether black can leverage this queen activity to facilitate piece development or if white can exploit the temporary queen placement to their advantage. Unlocking the bishop's potential on f3. White now aims to exploit the pin on the d-file and prepare a coordinated attack, transforming the initially passive queen's bishop into an active piece poised for action. Seizing central influence. The knight rockets to e4. A bold maneuver challenging the pawn structure and hinting at aggressive intentions. Black aims to disrupt white's central harmony, potentially freeing the f6 knight and creating opportunities on the kingside. Observe how this piece occupation will dictate the subsequent piece exchanges and the overall fluidity of the position. Disrupting black's pawn chain is paramount here. Isolating and pressuring the c6 pawn after this exchange could prove decisive. Reclaiming the piece solidifies the central pawn structure and opens the c-file for rook activity, creating a dynamic imbalance where black has slightly more active pieces in exchange for a pawn. Reorienting the knight from the compromised d2 square aims to redeploy it to a more active square, potentially c4 or even f3 if circumstances allow, while also freeing the d1 square for the queen to potentially contest the open c-file or support other operations. Unlocking the kingside with the f-pawn advances the central pawn chain and creates a crucial outpost for the knight on e4, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed blockade. Reclaiming the e1 square allows the rook to connect with its counterpart, preparing for a potential endgame where piece activity is paramount, and also serves as a defensive post for the king should the center collapse. Unleashing a pawn storm onto the weakened center. This advance injects immediate chaos, threatening to dismantle white's pawn structure and open critical lines towards the king, forcing a sharp recalculation of defensive priorities. White snatches the pawn, regaining material equality but accepting a significant positional concession. The knight on b3, though on a central square, is now oddly placed, potentially exposed and without immediate support, inviting a counter-offensive from black's pieces that have been coordinating beautifully. Black's commitment to the central advance with this pawn thrust solidifies the queenside pawn majority and prepares to challenge white's rook on the d-file, potentially opening lines for the queen and bishop. Bolstering the central pawn chain. The bishop retreats to safeguard the e3 pawn and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the kingside, simultaneously opening a retreat square for the knight on d2. Suddenly the rook, previously sidelined, springs to life on the 6th rank, eyeing the weakened kingside and simultaneously preparing to contest the open b-file. A maneuver that profoundly shifts the tactical focus and introduces new attacking possibilities. The knight sacrifice on e4, while seemingly offering material, creates a fascinating positional gamble, aiming to disrupt black's queenside pawn structure and gain central influence. By eliminating the well-placed knight on e4, white hopes to unlock new attacking pathways and exploit the now less secure black king. However, black's response is crucial. If they correctly consolidate their position and avoid tactical pitfalls, white's daring sacrifice might leave them in a strategically unfavorable situation, lacking crucial defensive pieces. This move injects immediate dynamism and forces black to prove the soundness of their recent pawn advances. Opening the e-file for immediate counterplay presents a dynamic tactical opportunity, directly challenging white's reshuffled piece structure and aiming to exploit the newly created pawn chain. Reclaiming the knight from its outpost, white aims to solidify the central pawn structure and regroup its pieces, particularly looking to reroute the stranded knight back into the fray via the f3 square. The immediate challenge is black's imposing pawn chain and the active rook on b6, which exerts pressure along the b-file and could become a nuisance. This repositioning offers a chance to improve coordination, although it concedes some central space and initiative in the short term. The key will be whether white can successfully redeploy its forces before black's pawn advance on the queenside or central breakthrough becomes overwhelming. Seizing the open file with the rook, black launches a daring initiative, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances against the now exposed king. Challenging the bishop's reign on the long diagonal, this maneuver forces black to confront the exposed queen and precarious king's safety. A bold gambit, sacrificing a piece for a powerful passed pawn and aiming to disrupt white's king's safety. Boldly reclaiming the undefended d-pawn, white signals a desperate attempt to disrupt black's imposing pawn chain and force counterplay, even at the cost of a temporarily exposed king. Sacrificing the bishop to shatter white's pawn shield and seize the initiative on the open e-file represents a bold, dynamic choice by black, aiming to capitalize on the exposed king. White seizes the opportunity to eliminate the active bishop and simplify the position, trading a complex queen's gambit structure for a potentially more manageable endgame. The key idea is to remove black's dangerous piece that was eyeing white's king and creating tactical headaches, even if it means giving up the bishop pair. The bishop finally finds an active outpost on c4, eyeing the vulnerable white king and reinforcing the pawn chain. Attempting to untangle this knot of pieces, white repositions the knight to a more defensive posture, creating a potential outpost for the bishop on e2 should black advance further. Unlocking the diagonal for the queen. This maneuver immediately confronts the opposing knight and aims to disrupt white's coordinated pieces. Stepping in with that knight to c3 attempts to re-establish some central influence and prepares for potential pawn pushes or piece development, aiming to untangle white's slightly cramped position after the recent exchanges and the intrusion of black's bishop on b3. A bold exchange, sacrificing a key piece to eliminate a powerful defender of the enemy king and ushering in a new phase of the game where even material can no longer dictate the tempo. The king now stands exposed on a newly created open diagonal, begging for attention as the passed pawn marches onward. Recapturing the bishop opens up the queen's diagonal towards the now exposed king, hinting at a rapid assault. Regaining the piece with the knight from c3 opens up the c-file for potential future pressure, while simultaneously reinforcing the pawn structure and preparing to activate the dormant queens. Knight from b1. Resuming the struggle for queenside initiative, black aims to reactivate the bishop, seeking to disrupt white's newly consolidated pawn structure, even if it means temporarily sacrificing potential pawn gains on the queenside for more dynamic activity elsewhere. Relinquishing the central files for pawn protection now feels like a surrender of initiative, as the bishop pair for black exerts significant control over the diagonal. Activating the king's safe haven is paramount as the board simplifies, aiming to connect the rooks and prepare for potential activity on the open files.